Hey guys, today we're going to talk about early Kentucky explorers. Technically, it's a fourth grade lesson, but everybody could learn a little bit from it or review from it. We're going to start off. This lesson is going to focus in on two explorers. It'll be Dr. Thomas Walker and then Daniel Boone. And first, we'll talk about Thomas Walker, as he is considered by most to be the very first European to set foot in what is now Kentucky. Excuse me. So here's a portrait of Dr. Thomas Walker. You can uh, get a feel for the way he looked. He first came into Kentucky in 1750. He was from Virginia and he's working for a company in Virginia that wanted to acquire land in Kentucky. So his job was to travel into Kentucky and do a little bit of exploring and then report back as to what the land was like and what he had found. And he's credited with finding the path through the Appalachian Mountains. And if you guys think back, the Appalachian Mountains was a natural landform barrier between the 13 colonies and moving further west. And so he finds a gap, and that's literally like a little path in between a couple of the mountain peaks. And he names that path the Cumberland Gap. And just on the other side of that gap, he comes to a river, which he also names Cumberland. Cumberland Gap, Cumberland River. And the reason that he names the gap and the river Cumberland is because the Duke of Cumberland was paying for the expedition. The Duke of Cumberland was a nobleman from England. Here's a photograph of the Cumberland Gap. You can kind of see where I'm moving the mouse. There is just this tiny little space, little movement, and you can go in between the mountains here. And that's going to be the path that almost all of the early Kentucky settlers take as they come into Kentucky. Beyond the Cumberland Gap there, you can see the Cumberland River in the background. Pretty cool picture. And so that's basically what Thomas Walker is known for. He's known for being the first European to kind of come into Kentucky. He discovers the Cumberland Gap and he discovers the Cumberland River and names them for the Duke of Cumberland, who's who's paying for his expedition. Next explorer that we'll talk about is Daniel Boone, and most of you have probably heard of Daniel Boone at some point. This is a very famous picture of Daniel Boone with his dog. He's got his long rifle and his coonskin hat. And he's got his powder horn here. That's where he has his gunpowder. He's got on a coat made probably from deer skin or some sort of leather with fur, and it's lined with fur to keep him warm in the winter. And then there's his coonskin or beaver skin hat. And Daniel Boone is known as a famous long hunter. And a long hunter, that's somebody that goes on a hunting expedition for an extremely extended period of time. Could be months, could be even years in some cases. They go out into the wilderness and they hunt primarily for beaver skin, beaver fur, or any other animal fur they could get because animal fur was so valuable. And remember, animal fur is very valuable because the Europeans don't have access to the large populations of beaver that they could catch or kill to get the fur. But there are an abundance of beaver in North America, and so the long hunters like Daniel Boone are looking for animal fur. They want beaver fur, buffalo fur, or and also deer. And so they will go out into the wilderness for months and years at a time and hunt and trap over and over and over and over again and gain a very large amount of these furs before they come back. And they can sell them for a large profit. So Daniel Boone, he goes into Kentucky in the year 1767. And he stays on a long hunt there till 1771 for animal fur. And he's on his way back to Virginia from Kentucky with all of his animal fur, and he gets stopped by some Native Americans who are very angry because he's hunting on their land, and they take all of his animal fur. and so he doesn't get to take any animal fur back with him from that trip. The Indians are angry not only that he's hunting on their land, but they're also angry because he's just taking the animal fur. Where the Indians, when they would hunt, they would take every single part of the animal and use it for something, and they thought that Daniel Boone was wasting their game, their wild animals, by not using every part of the animal and only wanting the fur. So he ends up empty-handed. Daniel Boone ends up being empty-handed on that trip. He heads. He has to leave. The Indians force him to leave. He comes back in 1773 with 40 settlers. He's going to try to start a permanent settlement in Kentucky, but once again, a Native American tribe says nope, you're not staying here, and they force him off the land, and they head back to Virginia. A couple years later, Daniel Boone wants to start another settlement, and this time Daniel Boone's working for the Transylvania Land Company, and he makes a deal with the Cherokee Indians and buys 17 million acres of land. It's just an insane amount of land. So he buys a huge amount of land in order to start a settlement. But things don't really work out quite the way you might think after buying the land, because other Native American tribes, they don't honor this land deal because they don't believe the Cherokee own the land. And so Daniel Boone is still going to run into a lot of issues with Native Americans, even though he's bought the land from the Cherokee tribe. And our next lesson, for next fourth grade lesson, we will get into those first two settlements, and that'll be Boonesboro and Fort Harrod, and we'll talk about in detail how those forts are similar and how those settlements are similar. Those are the first two of the first major settlements in Kentucky, and we'll get into those settlements during our next lesson. So just as a quick review, we'll fly back up to the top here. So Dr. Thomas Walker, he's credited with being the first European to travel into what is now Kentucky in 1750. And he finds the Cumberland Gap, and he finds the Cumberland River. There's the Cumberland Gap and Cumberland River. He finds those. That allows everyone follows that path that settles Kentucky in the early days, because you can actually ride your horse through and pull your wagon through where you couldn't get your wagon over the mountains. So it's a very, very big deal for settlers, because they can bring a lot more with them than just what they could carry. And Daniel Boone is the famous long hunter that he hunts in Kentucky for animal skin. He gets his animal skins taken away. He tries to start a settlement. They force him to leave. The Indians force him to leave. And then he works with the Cherokee and buys a bunch of land and starts a settlement. And we'll get into what happens with those settlements in our next lesson. So thank you guys for your attention. Thanks for listening. And hopefully we're doing a good job. Miss you guys. Talk to you tomorrow.